Hey, it's Mac with PriceActionTradingSystem.com, and it is Thursday. It is August 20th, and believe it or not, another week's gone by. I mean, we're almost done with August, another week, and we're into September. At least we did get some movement today. The market looked pretty good today. The market looks much more normal than it has in the past, but today was a pretty good day, and it was all uphill. It was pretty easy early on to kind of get an idea where we might go. Notice that people still ask me about this, and it's just so hard to get people to understand it. But this is where we closed yesterday. There's the 3 o'clock close right there, which is the regular S&P, the INX, I believe is what it's called, what uh, it is. And then this is the 3:15, which is the what time your this market will close, the electronic market. And so we've been using both of those, but 3 o'clock is what I'm really looking for because this gap is on the daily chart. And I understand that on the daily, the INX market, or the true S&P 500, it closes right here at 3, and it doesn't open till right here at 8:30. So if you try to picture, this is gone, and you can see the difference between where it closed and where it opened. So on that particular chart, there's a gap there because we closed here and we opened down here, and there's no trading in between. So I think that's what throws people off. They're looking at this chart and saying, I don't see any gap. Well, there's no gap on this chart because it's trading 24 hours. All this in the gray from this black line to where it turns white is not on the daily chart. It's just from here, it closes here and it opens here, and that leaves a gap there. And price charts don't like gaps, so the odds are we're going to trade up, if nothing else, just to here to fill that gap. So I hope that clears it for people, uh, because it just seems to confuse people, and they keep saying, I don't see a gap. Well, you won't see a gap on this chart. I'm not looking for the gap on this chart. That's why I have the lines to help me find it and see it. But it's important to know about because you can see prices try to fill it, and you can see it took a little while, but we finally got through there, came back and tested it and went on. So, and you can see really both that 3 and 3:15 coming into play, but when it comes back to test it, it comes all the way back and tests the 3 o'clock one. I still like the 3 o'clock one, and that was originally the original intent. And my two-tier channel here, I adjusted a little bit. I couldn't decide if this was it earlier, if it was flatter. And because we were turning down a little bit sooner, I went with the flatter one earlier. But once we went higher here and stayed up here, it was pretty obvious that this was the correct one. So I didn't quite have it right early this morning. This was the right one, but it didn't really matter. The other one got you close enough, and you use these shorter term ones to keep you on the right side. And so some of these I don't always put the both sides of the channel on, but just there, and just draw them and move them over if you want to see them. I usually recommend that newer traders put them both on there, but I've done this so long I don't have to put either one of them on there, and I can see it just at a glance. But if you're new to this, you probably won't. You'll need to put at least one of them on there, and probably both of them. So, but anyway, several of you asked me about my dog. I mentioned my dog yesterday, and for those of you that don't care about dogs or don't want to hear about my dog, just bear with me a minute. But I told a few people that I would probably tell the story about my dog. There's a very interesting story about this dog. Me and this dog were destined to be together, and he's like family to me, and I was really concerned about him. But first of all, he's fine. They told me that he was in excellent health, other than he's got a gastrointestinal problem. And so they gave me some antibiotics and some stuff for his sickness because he's been throwing up and he's been having problems at both ends, so to speak. And it's been going on for several days. So he was really sick yesterday morning. He wouldn't eat anything. When he won't eat anything, something's wrong with him. So I took him to the vet, and they told me he's super healthy. But the interesting part of this that I want to tell you about was how he became my dog. And it'll tell you how tough a dog he is and how loyal dogs are to people and so forth. But I was fishing at a creek in some backwoods, and I probably had to hike in there 1.5 to 2 miles to this fishing hole. And it's kind of a secret fishing hole of mine. And I found him laying on the bank of that creek, almost dead. I wasn't sure what was. I thought he had been snake bit, is what I thought had happened to him at the time. But I picked him up. He's about a 70-pound dog. He wasn't quite as big then. He's a little fatter now than he was when I found him. He was probably about 10 pounds lighter. But I had to hike him out of there, 50 pounds, just trying to carry a sick dog and he was dirty and nasty. And he was almost dead, so he didn't put up much fight. But it was pretty tough. But I hauled him out of there and took him home, and this was about 10 or 12 years ago, and he was about 4 years old when I got him. So he's somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. But I hauled him out of there, took him home, nursed him back to health, and I never really knew what was wrong with him. I didn't really think he was going to live, and I didn't want to take him to the vet when I thought he was going to die. But he hung in there, and in a couple of days he was better. And then about 3 days later, he was up like nothing ever happened to him. But what had actually happened to him, and this is, some of you are squeamish, and it's probably going to be. I'm not going to go into any great details, but he had been shot in the chest, and there was no sign of any entry wounds. It was probably like a small caliber rifle, like a 22 or something like that. But somebody had shot him, and to this day, he still has the bullet lodged in his chest. It's actually in one of his lungs, and they did a new X-ray on him yesterday. Is what brought all this back to me, and they asked me about it. They said they saw something metallic in his chest, and they asked me if he'd been shot, and I told them that I didn't know that he had been shot, but when I found him on the creek bank that day, he was almost dead, and they said, well, that was what had happened to him. He'd been shot, and it was in one of his lungs, and he said that it had metastasized and that there was a cyst around it, and his body had just encapsulated it and taken it on as part of his body, and that it's not bothering him. And I never would have known if they hadn't caught it in the X-ray. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting story, and I thought I'd take a minute to share it to you. But he's an incredible dog. He's part of my family, and I was really worried I was going to lose him yesterday because he's getting on up there. He's old, but the old saying that your dog will love you unconditionally. There's no doubt that dog is, he waits on me to come home. He follows me around the house until I leave again. And me and him have been close since the day I hauled him 2 miles out of the woods there. So anyway, let's get to the chart lesson. But again, those of you that aren't interested in hearing about dogs that came here to hear about trading, I appreciate you tolerating me and let me tell that story, because I know there's some of them that wanted to hear it, and I told them I would share that story with them. But anyway, let's talk about trading. Early on, again, we were trending up here. You could see the two, and we pulled back, and we're making higher highs and higher lows. It's still a little bit sideways action. You could still trade this both ways at this point. Once we started this big trend, I wouldn't trade this both ways. But here you can clearly see that we're swinging above and below the EMA. Look how here everything's above the EMA. This is a strong trend now. Here it's an uptrend, but it's a lot of sideways action. So you could trade this both ways. So anyway, when we started trending down, notice we had this working up. We get a first entry, and then we actually get a second entry. But I treated this like a double top. So there's 2 legs back to the EMA, and when it breaks higher right here and fails and turns down, I like going short there. And you can see that little short-term brown channel. That was all I was looking at the time, but I ended up drawing the bigger one when we continued to go lower. And you could get that off this side and drag it over, and it still fits really nicely over here. So you can see there's obviously, and just remember this, the price action works in layers. That's why it works on every time level, and this is a clear channel here, but it's just a channel within the bigger channel. And then you got a little sideways range within the bigger channel. So it's layer upon layer. And that's where people get thrown off. So make sure you hear that. This thing has layers to it, but that's why it works so beautifully at any price level and on any chart. But anyway, you get a failed second entry long there. It's a quick, easy trap. You can tell that the longs that were all piling up here had to get out. And this came right at 7 o'clock. This is right at 7 o'clock too. And so then we come back to the trend line. You get a first entry, and technically this is a first entry by the count because we made a little lower low there, but you can clearly see two legs back, a leg up, a correction, a leg back. And that's right off the EMA, right off the trend line. It is a little bit congestive, but it actually broke higher and turned down. So I like trading that as an engulfing bar. And you can see it took it a few minutes, but that trend line and the EMA went on out and it dropped on down. It turns out to be a pretty good trade. You could have got a runner off of that one. And it runs on down. And of course we bounce down here and we go higher. And so now that we're making higher highs and higher lows and another higher low, once we start trading up here, you want to try to figure out there's some kind of trend or channel here or something. I wasn't clear if it was, here or down here. And it turns out that I think it's down here in the end. We just didn't really have enough price action yet. But still, if you had either one of them, you were in the right vicinity. And you don't have, a lot of times people will be concerned because their trend channel is off just slightly from mine or something. But as long as you're close, generally close will work. Sometimes if you're way off, there's no hope for you. But if you're close, you're probably still going to come to the same conclusion. So anyway, we bounce down here. You get a first entry short. You push through the EMA. You pull back. You get a second entry short. And it's just crawling up that trend line. It fails, so go long right there. And there's another quick, easy burst up, and that's that failed second entry reversal. And that's a nice little reversal there. And you can see how all the shorts now, just like all the longs had to exit over here, now all the shorts have to exit. Then you get a nice two-legged pullback to the EMA, and you get a nice bullish bar. Just go long there, and there's another quick move up, and then notice how we push back, pull back once, we pull back twice, and that's a failed second entry short. So you can go long there if you so choose. It's not a great setup because it's a little bit congestive. We're not quite back to the EMA, but with that strong leg, you can assume we're going to probably at least get a measured leg up. So measure that. And so you're looking for a target here, and that was another reason I had the channel a little lower, because it met the target too, and generally those targets are pretty close, but you can see we went on higher. But the reason we kept going is because the trend channel line was a little higher up here. But that gives you confidence to keep going here. And then you make another new high and you pull back, and then there's a first entry right there above this bar. And then notice you don't make a new high, so you pull back. So when we broke higher right here, that's a second entry long. Again, it's a little bit congestive, but what we're doing is this is a pretty strong move, and we're just working sideways back to the trend line. And you could draw that trend line off the highs and drag it over, and you can see it fits nicely. But then we pull back and make a failed second entry short here, and that's right off the trend line. So now I like going. You can tell that's when it takes off, because that's when the smart traders are jumping in. Notice the low right there. You try to go lower once, twice, and that also confirms that trend line. That's probably another reason. That's not a perfect signal bar, but because it's a failed second entry short, you could really trade that like one. Off it goes. Pulls back. You get a first entry. It pulls back, and there's a second entry here, but that is right into we just filled the gap, and you can see across here that's pretty much where the overnight highs are. So I'm real reluctant to go long there out of that congestion. So it corrects back. But again, you just don't get a setup here, and it runs back up, and that's where it would meet the trend channel, and then it turns back down. And you do get notice you're working down, you get a first entry, and it tries to go lower. So when it breaks above here, it's a second entry long. But you don't know that we're not going to run all the way back down here. And that is congestive. We are below the EMA. So even though there's a second entry there, I don't think you want to go long right there. Wait for the higher low, which comes here, and again, there's no setup. There's no good signal bar. Runs on up. There is a failed second entry short here, but again, it's congestive, and now we're getting too close to this. So again, I just don't think there's a good setup in here. And then you can see we finally get the break, we move to a new high, then we make a first entry, and notice how we push under the EMA. That's not a good sign when you're expecting prices to go lower. You know, prices could come all the way back to the trend line, but at least they're probably going to come back to this midline. And so don't go long right there. I had at least one trader ask me about that failure right there. But the fact that it pushed through the EMA and then is not a really good sign when you're coming off the highs up here. So when it breaks higher and fails, if it breaks lower, that's going to be a trap. And that's the only short I marked today. And the only reason is because at this point, we were looking for prices to come back here and maybe even down here because they're overdue for the trend line. And you got plenty of room there. So, but again, this is a fairly strong trend, and you're probably better off to skip any of those trades. But it comes down here, it bounces. You do get a close outside and new low. And so if you had a really good signal bar here, I mean, that's not a horrible signal bar. You might risk that, but I'd want to wait on a higher low. And that doesn't come till here. And it also just happens to be there's a new high first entry, pull back. So when it breaks above that bar, it's a second entry. So put your buy stop one tick above that bar right there. When it breaks higher, go with it. You had to kind of ride that one out. It kind of went sideways a little bit, but it took on off. And that's why I tell people, don't monkey around with your trades. Look, it broke higher and came all the way back and was bouncing at the same place. And that's why we put our safety stop one tick below that bar. Because if you put it anywhere else in there, you get stopped out. And another trader asked me about that. So, yes, there's an 8-tick maximum stop rule. We've pretty much been ignoring that because you couldn't use it with the volatility the way it was, but it's starting to get to where you can start to use that again. But that doesn't mean you put your stop in the middle of the bar. Your stop always has to go one tick below the signal bar, or if you're going short, one tick above it. Always. Don't ever put it anywhere else, because if you put it anywhere else, you get stopped out. And that's what this trader said. He says, I started putting it below, like you said. He said, I had 5 winners today. He said, so, but I'm confused about the 8-tick stop rule. Well, 8-tick stop rule doesn't mean you put your stop at 8 ticks. It just means you can't take a trade if it's bigger than 8 ticks. But pretty much after the volatility and trading it just like normal, I don't even know if I believe in the 8-tick rule anymore. I think new traders need it, because if they don't, they're going to try to go live too soon. They're going to blow their account. So you probably should still try to follow it. But the first rule is your safety stop always has to go one tick above or below the signal bar, depending on which way you're entering. That's number one. And then try to do it within 8 ticks if you can. And one way you might do that, let's see what this bar is here. This bar is 7 ticks. So really you need 1 extra tick on that. So what you might do is, instead of putting a buy stop here, let this break higher and put your buy stop 1 tick inside that bar. Use a buy limit stop. And then that would give you room to put it 1 tick below and still enter in the 8-tick rule. And guess what? It would have broke higher, pulled back, triggered your stop, and you could have got that. You could have followed the rules of putting your stop where it went, still got in that within the 8-tick rule, and had a good trade. And actually, you could have been even more conservative and put your buy limit order way down here. The only problem with that is you're going to miss the best trades. Here's another example. Let's say you tried that right here. Notice it only backed up 1 tick, and then it took off. So if you tried to be conservative here, you missed that trade, and that turns out to be a really nice move. So that's the dangers of that. But anyway, we're moving on up. We finally get a close outside, and notice you got a new high, first entry, then you pull back, and this actually breaks lower and turns and goes out the other side. That's an engulfing bar on the second entry long. And so you may take that trade. I marked it green because we're up here. There's some resistance here, but there's still enough room to get out before getting up here. And so, you don't know that it's going to overshoot and go way up here like that, but you don't need that. All you need is a scalp out of it. So you might take that trade. But somebody else asked me that too today about engulfing bars. There's nothing special about engulfing bars. All it is it triggered a second entry all in one bar, because you move up, you get your Actually, you make your new high, then you move up and get your first entry, and then you move down, and this actually breaks lower first and then turns and goes up. And so when it breaks above here on this engulfing bar, it still triggers a second entry. So you couldn't go long. Normally you'd have to wait for this bar to close, and let's just say it closes down here, and then you put your buy stop above it. Well, here, because it's an engulfing bar, it just triggers it all in one bar. So that's really the only difference. So there's nothing special about engulfing bars other than they sometimes allow you to enter a trade, and it triggers it all in one bar. So I hope that's clear. So that gets us through this. That's 20 minutes, which is what I'm trying to shoot for. And so we're right on track. So I'm going to wrap this one up. I hope you had a good week. No chart lessons on Fridays. Again, if it's a rainy day or I'm really bored and don't have anything else to do, I might put something up on Fridays, or I may do something that I'll post on Saturdays. I've been trying to do a few live trades on Fridays, and I do have a few that some traders have sent me, so I'll try to put them up, and we'll have them for either tomorrow or Saturday sometime. But no chart lessons on Saturdays. I just have to take a break. When you do this 5 days a week for, I think I've been doing this 10 or 12 years now, it gets a bit monotonous. It's a lot more work than people realize. I spend an hour and a half doing this video every day probably. And there's ways I could do it easier, shorter, but there's other challenges to that. So this works. So I'm going to continue to probably do it this way. But I do have to have a break 1 day a week. It's just 5 days a week is almost too much for me now. So that's why I've been taking Fridays off last year or so. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. We'll be back again to do it Monday. I'm done for today. Hope you had a great trading day. We'll see you next time. This is Mac with PriceActionTradingSystem.com.